Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a subject that resonates with so many dog lovers out there, canine epilepsy. But we're not just scratching the surface with seizures today. We're going deeper, looking at this fascinating article from the Veterinary Journal, and ready to unpack this whole complex relationship between epilepsy and all these other conditions that pop up alongside it. We're talking cognitive decline, ADHD-like behaviors, and even anxiety and fear.
It's a topic that, well, our understanding has really come a long way. We used to think of these comorbidities as, simply consequences of epilepsy, but this article paints a much more intricate picture, really.
All right, so let's dive in. The article mentions this term epileptogenesis, which sounds, well, pretty complex. What exactly are we talking about here?
Epileptogenesis, essentially it refers to the process of developing epilepsy. Think of it as the sequence of events that transform a normal brain into a brain that can generate seizures. It's a dynamic process, and honestly, we're still figuring out many of its mysteries.
So it's not like a flip is switched. There's this whole chain of events happening before that first seizure.
Exactly. And this process, it can be different depending on the dog, the underlying cause, and a bunch of other factors. The important point is that epileptogenesis itself might be contributing to these comorbidities. It might actually set the stage for a whole cascade of changes in the brain.
So it's not just the seizures themselves, but how the brain changes throughout this whole process.
Precisely. And that leads us to those newer perspectives mentioned in the article, moving away from that epilepsy explains everything approach. The relationship between epilepsy and these comorbidities is it's more nuanced than we once thought. One concept is bidirectionality, meaning they can actually influence each other. Anxiety, for instance, might make seizures worse, but those seizures could also be feeding the anxiety. It's like this two-way street.
So rather than a simple cause and effect, it's more like a feedback loop.
Exactly. And then there's this common cause hypothesis. It suggests there could be underlying factors, genetic predisposition, environmental triggers, even early life experiences that could be contributing to both epilepsy and the comorbidities.
So maybe it's not one causing the other, but rather they share a common root.
You got it. And that has huge implications for how we approach diagnosis and treatment.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the limbic system keeps popping up in this article. What is it about this part of the brain?
The limbic system, especially the amygdala and the hippocampus, plays this central role in both seizures and those functions that get disrupted in the comorbidities. Memory, emotions, behavior, the whole shebang.
Okay, could you unpack that a bit?
Yeah.
What exactly are the amygdala and hippocampus responsible for?
Well, the amygdala is, it's essentially our fear and anxiety center. Studies actually shown that if you electrically stimulate the amygdala in rats, you can trigger both seizures and anxiety-like behaviors and at the same time.
So stimulating that one area can produce both.
Exactly. And it really raises the question, could repeated seizures in dogs, especially those originating in or near the amygdala, be acting like this constant stimulation? Could that be contributing to anxiety over time?
That's certainly something to think about. And what about the hippocampus? What's its role in all of this?
The hippocampus, well, it's crucial for memory and learning. Now, in humans, there's this condition called hippocampal sclerosis, or HS, where this brain region is damaged, and it's been linked to cognitive impairment, even in people who don't have epilepsy.
So damage to the hippocampus can impact cognitive function even without seizures.
That's what the research seems to indicate. Interestingly, studies in dogs with epilepsy have shown hippocampal asymmetry, which could be a sign of HS. They've also found decreased hippocampal volume in dogs with cognitive decline.
So is it possible that HS is playing a similar role in cognitive decline in dogs with epilepsy?
It's a crucial question. We need to investigate it further. But it highlights this potential link between structural changes in the hippocampus and those cognitive challenges we see in some dogs with epilepsy.
Really fascinating. So specific brain structures could explain some of these connections. The article also mentions these things called functional brain networks. Now, what are those?
Think of functional brain networks as communication highways between different regions of the brain. fMRI studies in humans have revealed altered connectivity in people with epilepsy, especially in areas related to cognition and mood. It's like the signals are getting crossed.
And if those signals aren't flowing as they should, it's going to impact brain function overall.
Exactly. fMRI in dogs is still tricky, but as it becomes more accessible, we might uncover similar patterns that would give us even more insight into these connections.
It would be like getting this inside look into how the brain is working. Speaking of brain activity, the article talks about IEDs. Can you remind us what those are?
IEDs, or interictal epileptiform discharges, are basically these bursts of abnormal electrical activity in the brain. We can detect them on an EEG. The interesting thing is these IEDs can disrupt those brain networks we were talking about, even when there isn't an actual seizure happening.
So even when things seem calm on the surface, there's this underlying disruption going on.
Yes. Studies in children have shown that IEDs can lead to problems with memory, attention, and other cognitive functions. And we know that dogs with more severe epilepsy tend to have more IEDs.
More severe epilepsy, more IEDs, and potentially more cognitive issues.
That's the burning question. Are IEDs, these hidden bursts of electrical activity, a major contributor to cognitive and behavioral problems in dogs with epilepsy? That's something we need to explore further.
This definitely is more complex than I initially thought, but it's really starting to connect some dots. Let's move on to neurotransmitters now. How do they fit into this whole epilepsy puzzle?
Neurotransmitters, those are the brain's chemical messengers. And several key players are involved in both epilepsy and these comorbidities we've been talking about. Serotonin, for instance, is involved in mood, anxiety, and seizures.
One chemical involved in so many different things. No wonder this is so complicated.
You said it. There's even evidence that drugs affecting serotonin, like SSRIs, which are often used for depression and anxiety, can sometimes have anticonvulsant effects in humans. Studies in humans with epilepsy have also shown reduced serotonin receptor binding in brain areas associated with both seizures and depression anxiety.
Wow, so an antidepressant might actually help with seizures.
It has been shown in some cases.
Yeah.
This definitely points to some sort of shared connection, but we need more research in dogs to be sure.
That's the big question, isn't it? Is it the same story in our canine companions? What about other neurotransmitters?
Well, there's GABA. It's the brain's main inhibitory signal, basically putting the brakes on brain activity. A lot of anti-seizure drugs actually work by enhancing GABA, and interestingly, these drugs often have anti-anxiety effects too.
So what helps with seizures might also help with anxiety, maybe because they both involve this GABA system.
That's the idea. And then we have noradrenaline. There's some research in rats suggesting a potential link between noradrenaline, ADHD, and epilepsy.
So each neurotransmitter adds another layer to this intricate puzzle, and we're starting to see how they all fit together.
Right. But there's one more piece we need to add to this puzzle. Inflammation.
Inflammation, isn't that usually associated with injuries or infections? What's it doing in the brain?
Chronic inflammation is increasingly being recognized as a factor in various brain disorders, epilepsy included. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, though. Is inflammation a cause of seizures, or is it a result of them? We don't have a definitive answer yet.
But we know it's involved somehow. What evidence do we have?
We've found elevated inflammatory markers in the blood, in the cerebrospinal fluid, even in brain tissue of people, and, likely, dogs with epilepsy. These inflammatory signals can disrupt neurotransmitters, mess with the blood-brain barrier, and even impair how brain cells function.
And this disruption can contribute to seizures, A&D, mood, and cognitive issues.
That's the thinking. Inflammation could be this common underlying factor. And here's where things get even more interesting. There seems to be a connection to diet. Diets enriched with medium-chain triglycerides, or MCTs, can actually improve how mitochondria work and reduce inflammation.
Wait, mitochondria, aren't those the powerhouses of the cell? What do they have to do with all of this?
They're critical for energy production, and if they're not functioning well, it can lead to problems, including increased inflammation.
So MCTs could help these little powerhouses and reduce inflammation. How does that tie back into epilepsy and its comorbidities?
Well, studies have shown that diets with more MCTs can help with seizures, cognitive decline, A&D behavioral issues in both dogs and people.
So we're talking about a dietary intervention that could potentially address multiple problems at the same time.
Absolutely. It really speaks to how interconnected these seemingly separate conditions are.
This is all incredibly fascinating. But it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this complex topic.
You're right. And that brings us to our next segment, where we'll dive deeper into cognitive dysfunction in dogs with epilepsy. All right, so let's focus a bit more on cognitive dysfunction, which we touched on briefly earlier. It's a big concern for dogs with epilepsy, and it often gets kind of intertwined with those other comorbidities we've been talking about.
It really is like this cluster of issues that can impact a dog's quality of life in such a big way. Can you explain what cognitive dysfunction actually looks like in a dog?
Think of it as a decline in cognitive abilities, similar to what we see with Alzheimer's disease in humans. Dogs with cognitive dysfunction, they might start showing changes in their behavior, their sleep patterns, even how they interact with their owners. It can affect their ability to, navigate their world.
So it's more than just, say, forgetting commands or having accidents in the house.
Yeah, it's not just that. It actually affects multiple areas of cognition. Memory, learning, spatial awareness, even social interaction. It's this broader decline in how the brain functions.
That's really sad. How common is this in dogs that have epilepsy?
Research suggests it's surprisingly common. Some estimates say that up to 50% of dogs with epilepsy might also have some degree of cognitive impairment.
Wow, 50%. That's a significant number.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any specific risk factors that make a dog more likely to develop this?
Age is a big one, just like in people. Older dogs are more prone to both epilepsy and cognitive decline. Also, dogs with more frequent seizures or really severe seizures seem to be at higher risk for developing cognitive dysfunction. And this kind of ties back into those underlying mechanisms we were talking about earlier, inflammation and damage to key brain structures.
So those repeated seizures, they could be taking a toll on the brain over time, eventually leading to cognitive decline.
That's a strong possibility. But we also have to think about the medications used to manage epilepsy.
Could the medications themselves contribute to those cognitive problems?
It's a valid concern. Some anti-seizure medications, especially the older ones, can have cognitive side effects, especially in senior dogs.
So it's a balancing act. You need the medication to control the seizures, but it might also impact the dog's thinking.
Exactly. It's a tough balance that vets and owners have to figure out. Working closely with your vet is so important to find that medication that works best and has the fewest side effects. It might mean trying out a few different medications or adjusting doses.
It's about finding that sweet spot, right?
Yeah.
Are there any other factors that could play a role in cognitive dysfunction in dogs with epilepsy?
Breed seems to have some influence. Certain breeds, like the Legato Romagnolo, they tend to have a higher incidence of both epilepsy and cognitive decline.
Interesting. So genetics could be involved too? What about other underlying health conditions? Could those be connected?
Some research suggests a possible link between an hypothyroidism and cognitive decline in dogs with epilepsy.
Hypothyroidism. That's when the thyroid hormone is low, right?
That's right. Thyroid hormones are crucial for the brain to function properly, so if there's a deficiency, it can definitely impact a dog's cognitive abilities.
So it's something else to consider. If a dog with epilepsy starts showing those signs of cognitive decline, maybe it's worth checking their thyroid levels, right?
Absolutely. Early detection and treatment of hypothyroidism could really help slow down that cognitive decline.
This is really helpful. What can be done to actually manage this cognitive dysfunction in dogs with epilepsy? Is there any hope for these dogs?
There's definitely hope. Now, we don't have a cure for cognitive dysfunction, but there are several things we can do to manage those symptoms and help improve the dog's quality of life.
What can owners do at home to support their dogs?
First and foremost, getting those seizures under control is key. If we can reduce the frequency and severity of seizures, it might slow down how fast the cognitive decline progresses.
So back to that medication balancing act we talked about.
Yep. Exactly. But beyond medication, there are some lifestyle modifications that can make a huge difference. Enrichment is really important. Providing mental stimulation through things like puzzles, games, training exercises, that can keep the brain active and engaged and potentially slow down cognitive decline.
So like brain training for dogs.
Right. It's about challenging them mentally, keeping those brains working. Physical exercise is important too. Regular walks, playtime, it improves blood flow to the brain, helps reduce stress, and promotes their overall well-being.
Healthy body, healthy mind.
Precisely. And don't underestimate routine. Dogs with cognitive dysfunction, they often do better when things are predictable. So having a consistent schedule for meals, walks, playtime, even bedtime, it can help reduce anxiety and confusion.
Creating a safe and predictable environment for them.
Yeah.
What about diet? Anything specific that can help?
Those MCTs we were talking about, they can actually be helpful for both seizure control and cognitive function. There are also some special diets made just for dogs with cognitive dysfunction. They usually have things like antioxidants and other nutrients that are good for the brain.
So it's about feeding their brains as well as their bodies.
Exactly. And finally, there are medications specifically designed to manage cognitive decline in dogs.
Oh, what do those medications do?
They work by boosting certain neurotransmitters in the brain, like dopamine and norepinephrine. Those are important for cognitive function.
So little brain boosters.
Yeah, in a sense. They can help help improve alertness, attention, and overall cognitive performance in dogs struggling with cognitive decline.
Sounds like there are quite a few options to help manage cognitive dysfunction in dogs with epilepsy.
There are. It's important to remember, though, that every dog is different. What works for one dog might not work for another. Working closely with your vet is so important to come up with a management plan tailored to that specific dog.
So individualizing the approach is key.
Absolutely. While cognitive dysfunction can be tough, with the right support and management, dogs with epilepsy can still live a good life.
That's a really great message. We've covered so much today, from those intricate connections between epilepsy and its comorbidities to the ins and outs of cognitive dysfunction. Before we wrap up, I'm curious about the future. What's on the horizon in terms of treatment? Are there any exciting developments?
Well, there's definitely a lot of exciting research happening right now. Things are moving so fast, and we're seeing these promising developments that could really change how we think about treating epilepsy.
It's amazing to think about all the possibilities. Can you give us a peek into what the future might hold?
One area that's getting a ton of attention is personalized medicine. Scientists are working on genetic tests that could actually pinpoint the specific cause of epilepsy in individual dogs.
So like a DNA test that could get to the root of the problem.
Exactly. And then we could use that information to create these targeted treatment plans. Maybe even better seizure control with fewer side effects.
That would be incredible.
Yeah.
What else is in the works?
They're also making progress with developing brand new anti-seizure medications. And these new medications, they're designed to target those specific underlying mechanisms we were talking about. Things like inflammation, those neurotransmitter imbalances.
So not just masking the seizures, but actually getting at the root of the problem. Maybe leading to more effective results, longer-lasting results.
That's the hope. And there's a growing interest in what we call non-pharmacological approaches, things like brain stimulation therapies.
Brain stimulation, what does that involve?
Well, they're looking at different techniques, but essentially it's about using electrical or magnetic impulses. They can actually modulate brain activity, maybe even reduce how often seizures happen.
That sounds pretty futuristic.
It's cutting-edge stuff for sure, and it's still early in the research for dogs, but it has a lot of potential. And beyond those high-tech advancements, there's this renewed focus on lifestyle interventions. Things like diet, exercise, all those things we know play a big role in managing epilepsy and those comorbidities.
So it's about looking at the whole picture.
Yeah.
Not just the seizures, but the dog's overall well-being.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that epilepsy is this really complex disease. It has these far-reaching effects, and managing it requires this multifaceted approach.
This has been such an insightful deep dive into the world of canine epilepsy. It's incredible how complex it all is.
I'm glad you found it helpful. The important thing is that we are making progress. We're understanding this condition better and better. And with that understanding, well, there's hope for better treatments, hope for brighter futures for dogs with epilepsy.
Thank you so much for walking us through all of this. It's really reassuring to know there's so much happening in the world of epilepsy research.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, from Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.